In this video, we're going to look at variable scope. That is, where a variable can be used inside of an application. So I've already created some sample code here. I have two variables, an integer called x, a string called sample string, and I have an overloaded function called variable tester. In my initial cout statements, I've just provided the values of both x and my sample string. Then I call my variable tester functions, and then we print out those values again. Inside of my variable tester functions, you can see that I print out the values of them while they're inside. I'm going to run this real quick, and then we'll explain what's happening. My initial value of x is 10, and my string value is my sample string. Inside of my functions, I print out that x is 11, and I change my string to be inside variable tester. However, when I return from my functions, my variables have not changed. If I look even closer, you'll notice that inside of variable tester, where I'm passing an integer, I'm using the exact same variable name. However, when I pass a variable by default to a function, I'm actually making a duplicate copy of that variable. So I'm not dealing with my original variable, I'm dealing with a duplicated copy. Because it's a duplicated copy, any changes that occur inside of my function, such as using x++ to increment a value or set a different value, or inside of y, where I set a completely different value, that means that any changes I make to my variables inside my function, whether it's simply modifying a value, for example, doing x++, or resetting to an entirely new value, such as y equals inside of variable tester, my values in my original function are not going to change because they are two separate entities. It doesn't even matter if my variable names are the same. This is pretty standard. A lot of people understand this as far as scope. But let's look at some other examples real quick. Here's some sample code where we can test variable scope again. All my variables are inside of my main function in this instance. I have an integer called x, and I have it set to a value of 10. My condition statement says that if x is less than 22, I'm going to create a new variable, another integer, and set it equal to x. And then I'm going to modify x. And then I want to print out y. However, if you notice, there is an error on y. If I go and build my solution, I get an error of identifier y is undefined. You might say, well, why is y undefined? It's clearly here inside of my if statement. Well, it's not clearly there inside my if statement. It is actually created inside my if statement and therefore is only valid inside the braces or my if block, if you would. If I try to print or do anything else outside of that if block, I'll get a identifier is undefined or an undeclared identifier, depending upon what application you're using as your compiler. So this generates an error for me because I'm outside of the scope of my if block where it was created. Let's look at another example. Similar, but slightly different. Here I'm using a for loop. And outside my repetition block, I have my initialization where I have integer I equals 0. I set that up. Then I run through the rest of my for block. Outside my for loop, I have a cout where I just want to print I. And I get the same type of error. And if I do a build, I'll get the exact same error message again. The for loop is a special case. Even though we create our variable outside of our repetition block, it is all considered part of the same structure. And therefore, our I integer is not visible outside of our braces or inside of the parentheses for our for loop. There is likely a quick and easy fix for this. I'm going to create a blank line above my for loop and define my variable int I. When I do that, I'm going to need to delete my integer I and only assign it a value inside my for initialization step. This gets rid of my error. And if I go and run it, I now see variables 0 through 5. 0 through 4 was printed out inside my for loop, and the last one was printed at the end of my for loop outside of it, where I can now reference my variable. So this is the basics of variable scope. By default, I can only use a variable inside the brace structure where I have created it, or inside of a nested brace structure from where I've created it.